In this lecture, we are going to make an assessment of the impact of reformism on the lives of Indian women. And the discussion on this subject has become, in recent times, very contentious, largely because of the rise of feminist history. In the first place, when historians actually try to probe into the reasons for the increasing sensitivity among sections of the Indian intelligentsia about need for reforms in relating to women in India, the criticism by the Europeans about something which is called the civilizational critic, by which the Indian civilization was actually consigned to an inferior position for keeping women in a very subhuman level. So it is suggested that in the face of such kinds of criticism by Europeans and the imperial ideologues, there was an urgency on the part of the Indian reformers to undertake social reform, or at least to take some measures in order to improve the status of women. The second major question surrounds the nature of the reforms. Some of these reforms certainly were of great significance. Even if they did not make an immediate impact, in the long run, they had certain impact on social life. Widow remarriage, prohibition on child marriage. Sati was, in fact, after the legislation, it became increasingly rare. So it is suggested that many of these reforms were actually concentrated on the private sphere, domestic sphere. The private role of women as wives or as mothers, and doesn't actually visualize an active public role. The
Sir, how does this adequately explain the concern of the reformers?
To some extent, the criticism is valid to the degree that if you look at the catalogue of reforms to start with, Sati, the Anti-Immolation Act, or Widow Remarriage Act, all these were basically concerned with women as individuals living in a family. The educational project of the reformers would eventually lead to a questioning of this particular domestic role, because when women were encouraged to participate in the educational project in large number by going to institutions, by joining professions, and such things would become more prominent only at the turn of the 19th century. Far more important questions regarding women's public role began to be raised. But if you look at the latter half of the 19th century, barring the educational project which actually promised a greater public role of women, something that was realized only later from the 1920s and 1930s in an altered political context, most of the 19th century reforms were concerned with child marriage, widow remarriage, self-immolation or the forcible immolation of the widows in the funeral pyre of their husbands. So that is the concentration to start with, but then, or polygamy, the same problem. But you are right, to see the reformist initiative merely as something that was touching the domestic sphere is to ignore the long-term impact, because many of these reforms actually laid the foundation for the more ambitious reformist projects of the turn of the century. Women's voices were not so visible in the reformist projects of the 19th century, and such criticisms by the feminist historians have a certain validity, but at the same time, we cannot simply remain impervious to the fact that many of these reforms, despite these limitations, actually laid down the foundation for the more ambitious projects of the 20th century, by which women were actually encouraged to participate in public life more robustly on the strength of education. The third analytical level concerns the problem of class. Because what certain practices which became very common in upper class, upper caste households in Hindu society were not usually the case with the lower caste peasant families, where women had enjoyed a greater amount of freedom even in pre-colonial times. They were participating in the work process more actively than what was the case in the more respectable aristocratic households. But it is suggested that in the course of the 19th century, in certain instances, we have a reverse process going on in many of the peasant communities, where peasant communities were actually expecting their women to follow the behavior of the upper class women. There is an attempt to make an assessment of the kind of spread effect of this reformism and how was it basically confined within a certain class and largely was not so relevant for the lives of ordinary women. Lastly, the voice of women, something which we were suggesting, that in many of these reformist initiatives, the women's voice was absent. It was a male reformer project. They were debating on whether the scriptures in India give sanction to some of the inhuman, barbaric practices or vice versa. Such debates continued, and on the basis of the proper assessment of the Shastric sanction, the government actually took its measures. Before intervening, for example, in the debate on the burning of the widows, sati, the government became convinced about the fact that there was a substantial body of Shastric literature, scriptural literature, that actually would sanctify, that would actually legitimize the measure that the government was about to take against this kind of barbaric practice. So where was the women's voice in it? I mean, these male reformers were actually trying to debate with their adversaries over whether scriptures provided sanctions to such practices generally, avoiding the humanist problems. So you don't get the women's voice here. Lata Mani is one historian who has written on the sati, on the measures that the government took against this practice, and apart from talking about Ram Mohan's initiative in this, she drew attention to the fact that the main issues in the history of this government action centered around the theological discourses. I mean, you have on the one side the reformers digging up the Shastras to make out a certain argument which their opponents actually tried to rebut with reference to the Shastras. They were not actually bothering about the fact of whether women were participating in this process under compulsion. I mean, these people would always claim that women wish to die in the pyre of their beloved husbands, but they didn't mention that complex questions of property were also involved. It is suggested that in those regions where Mitakhara rule was prevailing, widow burning was rare, because Mitakhara would not give women any property at all. But where the Daibak system actually prevailed, where women had a certain share in the property, the tendency to burn widows was stronger. So this had something to do with property, but suddenly in the 18th century we find a certain resurgence of widow burning. I mean, one has to explain this, but we have not been able to study this problem as yet with that kind of detail. And what is noted by some historians, that a practice which had been limited to certain upper castes, superior caste groups, like for example the Rajputs, was not so widespread among the peasant caste. It was found even among the lower echelons of the society, people began to notice this sati being performed. You have a practice which had a certain sanction, but which could also be disputed, as Ram Mohan did, on the basis of scriptures. But you have a more complex story behind it where property was involved. The status of the widow within the family was involved. Obviously, this was the most remarkable reformist action, but there were other measures as well. Widow remarriage, for example. And we know that the Act of 1856, after the revolt of 1857, when the government became somewhat intrepid about pursuing this reform, was never enforced with the same degree of seriousness, so that reformers like Vidyasagar, who were campaigning for widow remarriage, found it difficult to convince the larger society to accept his ideas. And we have several accounts in which ultimately Vidyasagar's isolation and loneliness was explained in terms of the resistance that he encountered among his people. Similar was the experience of reformers like Vishnu Chiplonkar or Virashalingam in Andhra. Now, the point is that you have very interesting arguments by his feminist historians, like Lucy Carroll, for example. She has suggested that the Act of 1856, the Widow Remarriage Act, did not actually ensure social acceptability of these reforms. It did not actually ensure protection of the protagonist of widow remarriage from social persecution. We know from the memoirs of the radical Brahmas, for example, about how they were persecuted by their own people because of their involvement in widow remarriage. Secondly, in certain cases, it is suggested, once again by Carroll, that the Widow Remarriage Act deprived the remarried widows of the property of the deceased husband. So there are certain inbuilt limitations which would actually not allow the implementation of these reforms adequately. Polygamy, for example. There was a running campaign against polygamy by Vidyasagar. But ultimately, the legislative action came much later. Child marriage. It became a very contentious issue in the course of the later half of the 19th century. The first intervention came in 1860, when the marriageable age was raised to 10, and then you have the intervention in 1891, which created a lot of controversy among Indian intellectuals. On one side were the reformers who actively supported this measure, but on the other side, you have public-spirited men, nationalists, who felt that such kinds of intervention by the colonial state in Indian social customs was not legitimate. And even when we actually try to trace the history of the widow remarriage, if you look at the attempts by the government to respond to demands by the reformers to prevent child marriage, you cannot get away from the fact that the government was as much interested in obtaining legitimacy from the scriptures. Just in the same way, the protagonists of these measures were actually anxious to dig up adequate scriptural sanction for the reforms that they were espousing. So when you are actually obsessed with the idea of getting scriptural sanction for your reforms, usually refrain from undertaking a campaign in such a way that it would actually have a radiating effect in the larger society. You are actually working therefore with certain built-in limitations. Take, for example, the famous Tagore family, very enlightened family of the later half of in the 19th century. The Bengal Renaissance, in fact, was a creation of this family to a large extent. But we know from the memoirs and other accounts that most of the girls in the family were married very early. They practiced child marriage. Something in our own language was called Gauri Dan. So even a family like that was not entirely free from the influence of convention. So what was more important was not merely to conduct debates on Shastric sanction in the way Ram Mohan did, or in the way Ramakrishna Gopal Bhandarkar, the famous historian, was following the same practice of studying the ancient scriptures to make out a case against child marriage. But beyond this, you have this particular necessity of spreading this message in the larger society by undertaking a campaign against it. And in certain cases, the reformers had an ambivalent position about reforms.
Sir, what were the major limitations in the initiative for the reform of the women's status in the 19th century?
That is something which we are actually discussing, but to respond to your question, one of the main limitations came from the heavy concentration on Shastras. Instead of that, there should have been a more organized public campaign. But even the attempt to organize such campaigns was always resisted by the larger society. So the limitation came from the failure of the reformers to influence the larger society with these reformist views. The second major limitation comes from the politics of nationalism. A time came towards the close of the century when, as Tonika Sarkar tries to suggest in her famous work, Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, that the nationalist imagery made women a kind of a sacrosanct entity in the private sphere, whose lives were not likely to be tampered with by foreign intervention. So that was Tilak's position. During the age of consent agitation, when Tilak suggested that even if these reforms were intentioned, there was no need for Indians to depend on the intervention by the colonial state. Thirdly, and that is where once again Hindu nationalism played a critical role by diverting the attention from the main issues. Certain historiography began to emerge from the close of the century, which suggested that in historical times, the women had a better status. Say, women in the Aryan age had a better status. From a high position, their status began to decline. And some of these scholars would attribute the declining status of women to Islam. That with the advent of Islam, the freedom and independence that apparently women had enjoyed in the Vedic age was lost. Now, that is not acceptable. We know that from around the 1st, 2nd century AD, women's lives became more controlled by patriarchy. So the attention became somewhat defocused from the critical questions. And the social reform agenda alone doesn't actually make us aware of how many of these reformers take their position regarding the public role of women. So as you move away from reforms which affected mainly the private sphere and to education, for example, the problems that were inherent in the reformist agenda would become much more clear. Also, there is a class dimension, something which we often ignore. that the educational project became more relevant for women belonging to the relatively superior groups, superior classes, where women were actually confined within domesticity. Their access to education was limited by the belief that if they became educated, their husbands were going to die. You have such instances or such sentiments in literature, that women were actually prevented from reading and writing because of such kinds of beliefs. But on the other side, you have the educated Vaishnavi, who belonged to popular Vaishnava sects, and they used to come to these upper class households to teach the women of these upper class families the basic knowledge in reading and writing. They used to recite from the vernacular Mahabharata and Ramayana. So when we talk about education, when we look at the educational project, we also find another limitation where the education for women was looked upon as a measure to make them good wives of Indian offices in British Indian bureaucracy. Their wives were required to accompany them to their new stations. So these officials needed to have wives who were educated enough to be able to act as the best companions. So education became associated with what in the late 19th century, early 20th century emerged as the notion of a companionate marriage. Marriage was not intended only for preservation of the clan, but wives were to become companions. But the whole idea of education as a supplement to companionate marriage still bound women within the sphere of domesticity.
Sir, how do you explain this idea that reformism was actually reinforcing patriarchy?
You can answer this question at two different levels. That is, in the first instance, some people like Radhakanto Dev, for example, who was otherwise a great defender of orthodoxy, campaigned against government intervention in widow burning, was also a protagonist of women's education. Now, it's good that he was thinking of women's education, but it is important to ask this question. The person who was otherwise very hostile to reformers would allow this education for women. Secondly, you have very few women whose voice was recorded in this reformist project. You have the instance of Pandita Ramabai, for example, in Maharashtra, or Tarabai Shinde. Pandita Ramabai, for example, was a rebel woman. She was a Brahmin, she married a Shudra. After the death of her husband, she went to England. Also, she later went to the United States, reared up her child. It's a very unusual case. You don't get very many such examples in the 19th century. There may be a few Indian women who are writing about how they lived under conditions of oppression. Tarabai Shinde's writing on this actually acquired a degree of popularity. You have Rashundari Devi in Bengal writing about how women in these upper class families were living a life of degradation. Otherwise, you don't get much of women's voice in these reform projects.
So, when do we actually see women participating in public sphere in a larger number?
It is only after mass nationalism, after Gandhi intervened in Indian politics, and you have a whole range of other changes that had taken place in Indian society, that you see the public role of women. Sarojini Raidu as an example. But you have Bina Das and others who began to play a very important role in the militant revolutionary organizations. You have Pritilata Waddadar, for example, who is looked upon as a symbol of the assertion of women for a rightful place in the political movements. But if we contrast this with the later half of the 19th century, when many of these reformist projects had been undertaken, including the reform of education, we see the limitations very clearly. For example, in 1849, the Bethune School was set up. But between 1849 and 1882, when the Hunter Commission was instituted by the government to find out the spread of education, we find only 2% women were literate. 98% were illiterates. It is very easy to look at the more successful examples of women like Kadambini Ganguly in Calcutta or Pandita Ramabai, who came out of the Parda, who participated in public educational institutions and achieved a kind of social distinction. But these are rare examples of women anxious to achieve a kind of a public role in society. Otherwise, the main concern of the educational project was to create good wives, not to strengthen their public role, barring a few cases that we have mentioned. So, the real achievement, of course, came in the 20th century when women were allowed to break away from these bindings of domesticity, encouraged to play a more assertive public role, but that's a different story.